Our next speaker is an illustrious man who needs no introduction, yet I'm much obliged to introduce him. Ambassador T.S Tirumurti was an Indian diplomat with a career spanning 37 years in the service. Having joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1985, he has represented India's interests in various capacities before retiring in June 2022. He served as India's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York between 2020 and 2022. Ambassador Tirumurti had previously served in the Indian Embassy in Cairo, Egypt, where he had gotten his diploma in the Arabic language. He was the first secretary at the Permanent Mission of India to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, and he was also the first Indian representative to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. Later, he had served as consular at the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C., United States, and Deputy Chief of Mission in Jakarta, Indonesia. He was India's High Commissioner to Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur between 2013 and 2018. Ambassador Tirumurti served as Undersecretary Bhutan, Director of the Foreign Secretary's Office, Joint Secretary Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Maldives, and Joint Secretary United Nations Economic and Social Council. During his stints at the Ministry of External Affairs, he has also been India's negotiator in climate change and environmental related issues. This is just an outline of his illustrious career, a man of great experience, and it is my most extraordinary privilege to invite the ambassador to present the C3S Founders Memorial Lecture. I hand over the rostrum to you, sir.
Shri B.S. Raghavan, Director General Commodore R.S. Vasan, Admiral S. Venkatraman, His Excellency the Consul General of Japan, Ambassador Taga, representatives from colleges and universities, and distinguished friends. It's indeed a great privilege to be asked to give the Founders' Day Memorial Lecture on combating global terrorism, trends and challenges. I thank Commodore R.S. Vasan for his invitation and for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important topic. Let me felicitate you, Commodore Vasan, on the range of activities that C3S has been organizing. The founders of C3S have indeed contributed in no small measure to highlight the menace of terrorism and strive to enhance and protect our national security. What we are trying to do here is to build on this legacy, the legacy that they have left behind for us. Build on their thoughts and ideas and their strong national interest. They have put together the backbone of our national security architecture. So let me at the outset pay my respectful homage to all of them. Commodore Vasan and C3S have done much to preserve this legacy of the founders, and my appreciation to him and his team. When India entered the Security Council in January 2021 for a 2-year term, one of the priority areas we had identified was combating terrorism. Given our own experience with combating terrorism, especially cross-border terrorism, we felt that we could contribute to greater understanding of the phenomena and to a more robust UN and international response to combating terrorism. Consequently, we also wanted to chair the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee. Since the chair of the CTC was to fall vacant only in 2022, we did some very hard bargaining to get elected as chair of the CTC. As you're aware, I was ambassador and PR to the United Nations for 18 out of the 24 months we were in the Security Council. While I have no doubt that we contributed to enhancing the focus on terrorism, both in the UN and outside, in the 2 years that we were in the Council, it is important to understand the contemporary context to appreciate how India kept the course on this matter in the UN. Friends, 11th September 2001 was a defining moment in the fight against terrorism. Before 9/11, the world was divided into your terrorists and my terrorists. Since terrorism didn't quite shake up the West like it did to many others like India. But 9/11 proved that terrorism in one part of the world could devastate the center of Manhattan in New York. When this shook the world, suddenly it became a collective fight. They became our terrorists. It became a collective fight at the global level. The UN Security Council passed a binding resolution number 1373 on 28 September 2001 and also established the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee, whose chair for 2022 was India. In the last 20 years or more, apart from Resolution 1373, there have been significant strides taken to bring this collective focus to tackle many aspects of terrorism, especially financing of terrorism, nexus with other transnational crimes, Islamic jihadist terror, etc. While we are also in an era where contemporary and emerging technologies are being weaponized by terror groups and individuals. Each of these sources are coming under the scanner. However, while there is definitely a more concerted effort at a broader level, there is a more disconcerting scenario which is unfolding. After more than 20 years of 9/11 uniting us to fight the common menace of terror, we are in the danger of drifting back to the era of your terrorists and my terrorists. We have just entered the era where, after pronouncing that there can be no excuse or justification for terror, there are moves to categorize terrorism based on motivation for such acts. For example, talking about Europe, the preoccupation of Europe has turned to the rise of their right wing. They have identified right-wing violent attacks as their main terror threats. They are being called variously, like right-wing violent extremism, or violent nationalism, or far-right terrorism, or more simply, right-wing terrorism. Interestingly, the rise of their right wing has made Europe defensive while accosting other forms of terrorism across the world, including especially the radical Islamist jihadi terror upsurge in their own countries. Consequently, they are increasingly unable or unwilling to fully support counter-terrorism efforts elsewhere, whether in Asia or in Africa. As far as the United States is concerned, their priority domestically changed, and they are dealing with what they call racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism, REMV, and related terror attacks. They have called it this, not me. This domestic brand of extremist terror has been their main focus. While the United States has continued to attack select high-value terror targets and closely cooperate with India to bring terrorists under the ambit of the 1267 sanctions regime of the UN Security Council, after what happened in Afghanistan and their ambivalence in calling Taliban for full implementation of the benchmarks which has been set out by the UN Security Council Resolution 2593, especially on terror, and the mixed signals of the United States against state-sponsored cross-border terror from Pakistan, the US may well step back from a more robust strategy to tackle terror in Asia and Africa. China has claimed that it has its own terror-related issues to tackle, which has made them compromise on a broader global strategy in order to secure their interests. Once again, their moves to legitimize the Taliban rule in Afghanistan without the Taliban meeting any of the UN Security Council resolution benchmarks, 2593 benchmarks, can be seen in this context. their blocking of our attempt to list terrorists under the UN Security Council 1267 sanctions list is yet another example. So when we look at these developments, it seems that the West and other countries are getting preoccupied with terrorist threats which are at best limited to certain national or regional contexts and certainly not global. Though they are important in their domestic context, no doubt, their narrow focus on terror by the West and others has diluted their larger global focus. We are now slipping back to the my terrorist, your terrorist era. Another and probably larger danger in these labels being given is that they completely ignore that in democracies, right wing or left wing is part of the polity because they come to power through the ballot. To demonize these ideologies rather than the violent acts by such arbitrary labels may militate against democracy itself. This is a serious matter which is, however, not within the scope of my current speech. Consequently, India's endeavor has been to keep the focus on a collective fight against terror, irrespective of regional and local variations and motivations. Friends, during both our presidencies in August 2021 and December 2022, we held high-level meetings on terrorism chaired by our External Affairs Minister. Speaking on this occasion, our External Affairs Minister recalled his statement to the Council in January 2021 and his 8-point action plan he had proposed on counter-terrorism. This 8-point action plan includes, number 1, summon the political will. Don't justify terrorism, don't glorify terrorists. 2, no double standards. Terrorists are terrorists. Distinctions are made only at our own peril. Number 3, don't place blocks and holds on listing requests without any reason. Number 4, discourage exclusivist thinking and be on guard against new terminologies and false priorities. Number 5, enlist and delist objectively, not on political or religious considerations. Number 6, recognize the linkage to organized crime. Number 7, support and strengthen FATF. And number 8, providing greater funding to the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism. So we made sure that right through the 2 years we were in the Council, every issue on the agenda of the Council also addressed the issue of terrorism. As chair of the UN Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee, we kept the spotlight on increase in terrorist activities in specific regions, especially in Asia and Africa, and the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes. In fact, we ensured that a separate meeting on recent developments on terrorism in Africa was held to put the spotlight on the huge spurt in Islamic jihadist terrorism in that continent. It was rather surprising when on one occasion when I was chairing the Counterterrorism Committee, some members objected to the use of zero tolerance to combat terrorism in the chair's draft statement. This phrase is used in numerous texts, including in the UN. They wanted deletion of this phrase since they said it undercut human rights, including that of the terrorists. I had to point out to them that terrorism was in fact the biggest violator of human rights. So at the very best, or at the very least rather, it is important to ensure that our fight against terrorism is not diluted in any manner. In a unique initiative, we brought the CTC meeting to India in October 2022 at a time when India was celebrating the 75th anniversary of our independence. The focus of this special CTC meeting was on the use of new and emerging technologies by terrorist groups and the gravity of the threats posed by them. The meeting was attended by more than 400 representatives from 54 member states, 33 international and regional organizations, and many others. The highlight was also a visit of the CTC to Mumbai to pay homage to the victims of the 26/11 terrorist attack in Mumbai at a solemn wreath-laying ceremony at the site of the attacks. The landmark Delhi Declaration on countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes was adopted during this special CTC meeting. And it focused on three key areas, namely, 1, countering terrorist exploitation of information and communication technologies. Number 2, threats posed by terrorist use of unmanned aerial systems. And 3, countering financing of terrorism as it relates to threats associated with new payment technologies and fundraising methods. Proliferation in online activities, especially during the pandemic, has given terrorists the opportunity to target youth, including through gaming platforms for recruitment and radicalization. Social media has been used to create an online echo chamber of hate. Sophisticated communication methods like online gaming, chat rooms, and restricted access sites have sprung up. Modern fundraising and payment technologies and new payment methods are being misused freely. Commercially available unmanned aerial systems, UAS, are used by Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and of course by our own neighbor Pakistan for terror attacks and arms trafficking. Potential misuse of AI, synthetic biology, and 3D printing remains high. In other words, we have entered a far more sophisticated and dangerous era of terrorism. Apart from initiatives undertaken by governments to counter these sophisticated terrorist methods, other significant initiatives include Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, GIFCT, Global Counterterrorism Forum, Tech Against Terrorism, etc. For example, GIFCT is the creation of global tech giants like Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, YouTube, etc. in collaboration with governments, industry, civil society, etc. Larger platforms, and to a certain extent, smaller platforms, they are actively removing terrorist content, mostly through AI and algorithm-based machine learning. And therefore, we just need to be conscious that for every technological opportunity, there is an even greater terrorist challenge. India also proposed several names of terrorists for listing under the UN Security Council Resolution 1267 relating to sanctions. In a significant development, the United States joined us as co-signatories for these proposals. However, our attempts to list these terrorists was thwarted, and a block was placed against listing them. But in a significant development, 2 weeks after we left the Security Council, one of our proposals for terrorist listing under 1267 was actually approved by the Security Council. This was the listing of Abdul Rahman Makki, Deputy Amir and Chief of Lashkar-e-Taiba, first listing with India as a proposer in the Council and co-signed by the United States. So this was also the first terrorist to be expressly named for terrorist acts in Jammu and Kashmir. And this is indeed a very big success for our diplomacy. Friends, this brings me to another parallel development in the UN and outside. This is the worrying attempt to politicize the phobias against non-Abrahamic religions and justify terror, as well as undertake terrorist acts due to hate against another religion. This has serious implications for multicultural, pluralistic, and democratic countries like ours. I think we all know that the UN has traditionally mirrored Christian values, and it is no secret. In fact, numerous such sculptures and symbols dot the UN, including the huge mural in the Security Council chamber, which combines elements from different Christian sources, including from the Greek Orthodox Church. A rare exception, in fact, is the 11th century idol of Lord Surya, the sun god, which has been gifted by India in 1982 to the United Nations. Be that as it may, The United Nations and the rest of the world have traditionally condemned phobias against the three Abrahamic religions, namely anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Christianophobia. And rightly so. Let there be no doubt about this, that religious hate should be condemned wherever they are. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and Christianophobia also got exclusive references in the UN resolutions, and a gradual consolidation of this Abrahamic religious grouping has taken place. And then on the 15th of March last year, 2022, taking advantage of the fact that the West were preoccupied with their own forms of terror to deal with, as I mentioned, and given their decreasing global focus, the Organization of Islamic Countries tabled a resolution in the UN General Assembly to declare 15th March as the International Day to combat Islamophobia. The resolution was co-sponsored inter alia by China and Russia. The resolution, in effect, singled out one religiophobia above all the rest, even if many of their own OIC countries were not convinced that this was the right thing to do. These countries even rejected India's suggestion to include the word pluralism in the text. The West was missing in action, and only India and France made explanation of vote. For the first time, combating hatred against one specific religion was elevated to an international day. And what is the implication of this? Firstly, we have recently seen some fundamental assumptions on which counter-terrorism measures rest being questioned. One of the things our permanent mission also actively participated during my stint as ambassador is the adoption of the fourth UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy in June 2021. This was in the UN General Assembly and not in the Security Council. During the negotiations, there was consistent attempts to dilute the references to terror as well as provide justification for terror. As you're aware, the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy adopted earlier states categorically that any acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable regardless of their motivation, wherever, whenever, and whomsoever committed. In fact, Para 3 of the UN Security Council Resolution 1566, adopted in 2004, says that terrorism is under no circumstances justifiable by considerations of a religious nature. In effect, it says that there cannot be any justification for terror. But when 3 terrorist attacks took place in France in 2020, the spokesperson of the High Representative of the UN Alliance of Civilization, UNAOC, said on 28 October 2020 that, and I quote, "The inflammatory caricatures have also provoked acts of violence against innocent civilians," unquote. So in one swift sentence, this UN body justified these terrorist attacks by providing it with a justification. And this justification was that of Islamophobia. It is not a secret that UNAOC depends on funding of Islamic countries for its survival. Fortunately, India held its ground. And in the GCTS report of June 2021, it held its ground against attempts by countries to provide justification for terror and dilute this fight against terrorism. Secondly, we are aware that all terrorist concepts say that terror cannot be attributed to any religion. Consequently, when such religiophobic attacks occur, they are conveniently labeled as terrorist attacks. But on the other hand, religion is used when we need a justification for a terror attack in many cases. We have been seeing this happen in recent past. For example, you would have all seen how analysts dubbed the attack on Salman Rushdie either as a terror attack or as an attack on freedom of speech. But no one called it a religiophobic attack, even though the author was attacked for his views on Islam and for that only. So if you do not recognize that these types of attacks are religiophobic attacks and not mere terror attacks as we understand it, one is going to further dilute the global fight against terror. Thirdly, even proposals for proscribing terrorists under Security Council Resolution 1267, They are given a religious color. Pakistan desperately tried and repeatedly to have Hindus listed under 1267 regime on cooked up charges, which was repeatedly rejected by the council. In fact, they put up the names of the same persons again under 1267 merely because they were Hindus. This is targeted hatred against one religion and nothing less. And as our External Affairs Minister said in his 8 points, enlist and delist objectively, not on political or religious considerations. Friends, 15th March resolution, which I just mentioned to you on the International Day, actually reflects an even deeper malice, which should be even more worrying: the gradual division of the UN on religious lines, Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic. This is gradually getting mirrored outside the UN as well. While it feigns to acknowledge is that in the last more than a decade, the attacks and hatred against non-Abrahamic religions have increased exponentially, in many cases emasculating minority voices. We are now in an era witnessing unacknowledged but unprecedented contemporary forms of religiophobia, including anti-Hindu, anti-Buddhist, and anti-Sikh phobias. In our own neighborhood and elsewhere, we have seen the destruction of temples, the glorification of breaking of idols, violation of Gurudwara premises, massacre of Sikh pilgrims in Gurudwaras, and destruction of the Bamiyan Buddha and other religious iconic sites. In Pakistan, attack against Hindu temples and their desecration and forcible conversion of Hindus and other minority communities have become commonplace. Hate crimes against Sikhs have also increased, including in the West, in the United States, which the External Affairs Minister himself pointed out, and elsewhere. And you have seen several recent news items of hatred in this matter. We have even seen Khalistani separatists who are Sikhs attacking Hindu temples. You've been reading it in the papers. Temples are being attacked in Canada, and Canadian members of parliament are calling it Hindu phobia. So these are the contemporary forms of religiophobia I was mentioning about. In fact, India sounded a warning note in the UN Security Council on 12th October 2021, when our Minister of State for External Affairs pointed to this contemporary forms of religiophobia. And he said, and I quote, "Our inability to even acknowledge these atrocities and phobias only gives these forces encouragement that phobias against some religions are more acceptable than those against the others." And he warned that we ignore this at our own peril. And sure enough, we had the International Day 5 months later. Understanding this distinction between terrorism and religiophobia is vital. And it's important that this difference is not papered over. And we are already seeing how this is taking root in the public discourse, especially in the West. Ironically, they are generating hatred against such communities in their own countries, their own citizens. And many of these are multi-religious and multicultural countries. This has serious implication for multicultural, pluralistic and democratic societies like India, leave alone their own societies. And pluralistic democracies cannot afford to watch the world go down this slippery slope, whether inside the UN or outside. India has a stake in ensuring that these values, our values, find greater resonance both in the UN and outside. And in spite of our traditional reticence in foreign policy to get involved in religious issues, we have no choice but to take the lead in the matter of contemporary forms of religiophobia. And this is important in combating terrorism in its broadest perspective. Friends, all I'd like to mention is that the next time you hear about a terrorist attack or a violent attack born out of a contemporary form of religiophobia, use the touchstone I have mentioned, and you'll realize why both these are dangerous for pluralistic society like ours. And as our minister said in the Security Council, we ignore it at our own peril. I thank C3S once again for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important occasion. And let me conclude by hoping that the idol of Surya, the sun god, who stands overlooking the corridor leading to the United Nations General Assembly, and the bust of Mahatma Gandhi, which has just been installed in December last year in the North Lawns of the United Nations, show an inclusive way forward to all members of the United Nations. And I thank you.